On June 19, 1863, Thaddeus Stevens was in fear for his life. The Pennsylvania congressman, who had spent the majority of his life fighting for an end to slavery, was now in the crosshairs of the Army of Northern Virginia, the principal Confederate army operating in the Eastern Theater. Stevens, in addition to being chairman of the powerful Ways and Means Committee in Congress, was a landowner and businessman here in south central Pennsylvania. One of his leading businesses was the Caledonia Iron Works, nestled at the foot of South Mountain along the Chambersburg Pike about 15 miles west of Gettysburg. In late June, Stevens made an inspection visit to his ironworks, and now the Confederate Army, on its invasion into Pennsylvania, was closing in on the area. This radical Republican, the scourge of the South, as one biographer would later call him, had to run. The iron furnace at Caledonia began operating in 1837 and expanded greatly over the next 3 decades. The South Mountain region was ripe with the raw materials, timber, ore, and lime, needed to produce iron for a burgeoning nation. Situated on a major thoroughfare, Stevens could transport his good with some ease. By the 1860s, the complex encompassed 18,000 acres, with prominent structures that included, quote, a furnace, 2 forges, and a rolling mill, and housing for about 100 laborers. The ironworks, however, rarely broke even. Employees would later say, quote, Mr. Stevens used to call it his sinking fund, and only kept it running to give people work. One of the clandestine reasons Stevens may have kept this sinking fund operating was its importance as a stop on the Underground Railroad in south central Pennsylvania. Hiram Wirtz, a local conductor operating just south of the ironworks, later recalled leading men and women north to a settlement, quote, near Caledonia Furnace, owned by that great champion of the slave, Thaddeus Stevens. Wirtz even claimed that William Hammett, superintendent of the ironworks for a time, helped care for and transport the enslaved who stopped nearby. On June 23, 1863, the first Confederate cavalry forces arrived at the ironworks. By this time, Stevens had departed on horseback north towards the state capital of Harrisburg. These Confederate cavalrymen, under the command of Albert Gallatin Jenkins, had been capturing free African Americans in south central Pennsylvania and sending them south into slavery. Now, they turned their aggression towards, quote, that great champion of the slave. John Sweeney, foreman of the ironworks, pleaded with Jenkins to spare the complex from the torch, offering him fresh horses and supplies instead. Jenkins, satisfied with Sweeney's offer, took the horses and departed. 3 days later, however, another, graver threat faced the community at Caledonia. Confederate Division Commander Jubal Early of Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps, Army of Northern Virginia, was ordered to march from his camp in Greenwood, just west of the ironworks, to the Susquehanna River, some 60 miles away. His route would take him right past Stevens' complex. A local newspaper quoted Early as saying, quote, Stevens is an enemy of the South in favor of confiscating their property and arming their Negroes, and his property must be destroyed. Early, defying an order from General Robert E. Lee to not harm private property in Pennsylvania, ordered his pioneer party to burn the Caledonia ironworks. He took some measure and excitement in doing this, as another local paper reported that Early, quote, seemed exceedingly fearful that he might miss the delightful spectacle of Mr. Stevens' works in flames. Years later, the outcome of the war still raw in his mind, Early would devote space in his autobiographical sketch to his decision on June 26. Quote, the enemy had destroyed a number of similar works, as well as manufacturing establishments of different kinds in those parts of the southern states to which he had been able to penetrate, upon the plea that they furnished us the means of carrying on the war. Besides burning many private houses and destroying a vast deal of private property which could be employed in no way in supporting the war on our part. and finding in my way these works of Mr. Stevens, who, as a member of the Federal Congress, had been advocating the most vindictive measures of confiscation and devastation, I determined to destroy them. This I did on my own responsibility, as neither General Lee nor General Ewell knew I would encounter these works. The destruction was devastating. For days after, Confederates in A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps, on their way towards Gettysburg, would pass and note the smoldering ruins of the complex. Commanding General Robert E. Lee would himself even stop to inspect the damage. Stevens estimated the loss of the destroyed buildings at about $65,000, but it did not destroy his resolve. On July 6th, he wrote to a former law student, quote, "We must all expect to suffer from this wicked war. I have not felt a moment's trouble for my share of it. If finally the government shall be reestablished over our whole territory and not a vestige of slavery left, I shall deem it a cheap purchase." Days later, he would add, quote, "They could not have done the job much cleaner. It is rather worse than I expected." Not to be deterred, Stevens had John Sweeney rebuild the Caledonia Iron Works. For the remainder of the war and after, until his death in 1868, Stevens would be a force to be reckoned with in Congress. He would be instrumental in drafting and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which outlawed slavery and granted African Americans citizenship and the right to vote. He would also lead the radical reconstruction of the former Confederate states, insisting on new state constitutions, legislatures, and enfranchisement for African Americans. John Sweeney continued to operate the complex beyond Stevens' death, and eventually it was sold off by Stevens' heirs. Today, the only vestiges remaining of this once great complex are a blacksmith shop and a reconstructed furnace stack. Part of the Caledonia State Park, they stand along the Lincoln Highway as stoic reminders of Stevens' crucial role in the American Civil War and Confederates' attitudes towards anti-slavery Northerners.